The Measure of Quiet Water. Episode 4. Mist Over Fennel Reach. Mist beaded on a fennel stem lying across moving water. Each pale drop gathered the muted morning into itself, then slid toward the channel and vanished. 3 more stems rested beyond it, their fine leaves darkened by damp, and another leaned from the bank as though it had not yet decided whether to fall. The lower channel needed clearing, but Amara crouched before she reached for anything. She set 2 fingers against the water upstream, watched the current divide around a stalk, and followed the trembling line beneath the small tangle. At the downstream side, the same cool thread pressed steadily against her knuckle. "It is still passing underneath," she said. Aaron knelt on the firmer edge and looked where she pointed. The clutter narrowed the run, but it had not stopped it. Beyond the stems, the water kept its quiet pace toward the lowest bed. Amara let out the breath she had been holding. Nothing here required a hurried pull on slippery ground. They could clear each fallen stem when the bank was ready to bear them. The sea mist had reached Fennel Reach before dawn and settled without wind. It softened the terraces into near and far shapes. The first bank clear enough to show every wet stone, the next bank gray at its edges, and lavender end below reduced to a low violet shadow. Fennel's sweetness hung in the damp air. It was warmer near broken stalks and cooler wherever the channel showed between them. Amara stood carefully. Moisture had already darkened the knees of her work trousers, and the cuffs of her sleeves clung to her wrists. She did not brush them dry. There was nowhere for the damp to go. Instead, she tested the path with the flat of one boot. The packed earth accepted the weight, but the grassy edge yielded. She marked that difference in her mind and moved back from the lip. Aaron had brought 2 woven baskets, a channel brush, a narrow wooden rake, and a coil of soft tying cord. He set each thing under the little tool eave at the upper end of the reach. The baskets smelled faintly of last summer's reeds. Their rims were dry only on the undersides. "I had the first sweep beginning here at sunrise. I had the first sweep beginning here at sunrise," Amara said. She unfolded the schedule from the oilcloth pocket at her belt. 4 neat hourly lines crossed the page, followed by a flush, a walk to Lavender End, and a final check at Reed Resting Pool. The ink had not run, but the paper had taken on the soft curl of the morning. Aaron looked up into the mist, as if a clock might be hidden there. "The mist began revising that before either of us arrived." His voice held no complaint. Amara studied the channel again. The plan had assumed that they could walk the lower path continuously, lift the fallen stems in one steady progression, and bring every basket back by the same route. The ground had made a different set of facts. A continuous sweep would ask them to hurry over damp turns, merely to preserve the shape of a timetable. Leela then came down from the upper terrace, carrying a small covered tin and a folded cloth. Droplets silvered the loose hairs at her temples. She stopped on the stone landing rather than crossing the yielding strip beside the channel. "I saw your baskets through the gray," she said. "Or I saw 2 round shadows and hoped they were baskets." "Oh!" Leela smiled and placed the tin beneath the eave. "Fennel biscuits for later." The irony seemed useful. Amara showed her the blocked stretch. Leela did not offer to step onto the bank. She watched the water appear below the stems and nodded when Amara explained that the lowest bed was still receiving a thread of flow. They assessed the reach without touching the debris. Aaron walked on the stone side and called out where the bank shone with surface water. Amara answered from the path, noting firm approaches, shallow footing, and places where a tool could reach from safety. Leela stood where she could see both of them, and shifted a marker stone whenever Amara named a boundary. The fallen fennel was modest in quantity, though the fine leaves made it look abundant. Some stalks were snapped and soft, others remained whole from bulbous joint to flowering tip. A few had settled against the first grate. None had lodged under the gate, and no earth had slumped into the channel. The water was clear enough to show its own brown pebbled floor. They began the assessment at the gate, because the shape of water above an obstruction could reveal what the stems concealed. Amara crouched on the gravel shelf, while Aaron stood one pace back. The surface behind the gate was no higher than its ordinary mark on the stone. No wet line climbed the bank. Beneath the wooden edge, the current passed without the thin whistle that would have meant a trapped leaf or fiber. Aaron touched the gatepost, then showed Amara his fingertips. They held only mist, not the fine green pulp that sometimes gathered when fennel was pressed repeatedly against wood. "Nothing has traveled up this far," he said. Amara recorded that in the margin. Gate clear. Level ordinary. It was easy to let the visible tangle below define the whole channel. The gate corrected that impression. The morning held a cleaning task, not a water emergency. They moved downstream by the broad path, stopping opposite each cluster. Leela stayed on the landing and repeated their observations, so Amara could hear whether each description was exact. 2 softened at the upper grate, Amara called. 3 long and sound at the curve. 4 visible in the hollow. Scattered stems at lavender edge. "And flow below all of them," Leela answered. The repetition was not ceremony. In the mist, a person could point toward one gray shape, while another understood a different one. Naming position, condition, and water together gave them the same map. Aaron added where a safe approach existed. Amara added where they must work from a tool's length. Leela wrote no quantities as promises. She wrote them as the count visible now. At one point, a bent fennel crown on the bank seemed to be another fallen stem. Aaron approached from the stone side and found it rooted, its weight lowered only by droplets. He did not lift it to improve the view. He traced its green base to the soil and left it bowed above the channel. By afternoon, it might rise on its own. That distinction mattered to Amara. Clearing was not the removal of every plant that entered the channel's space. Living fennel shaded the water and held the banks. Fallen stems, once softened, could catch more leaves and narrow the run. Their task had a boundary as clear as the channel walls. Remove what had fallen, preserve what still grew. Disturb neither bank merely to make the result look tidier. Leela came down one step and held the folded cloth at arm's length. Its pale surface made a useful background behind the mist-darkened stems. With it in place, Amara could see that the apparent mass at the upper reach was mostly fine leaves spread wide on the surface. The thick stalks beneath were few. She felt the size of the work settle again. They also tested the return route before loading anything. Aaron carried an empty basket from the eave to the upper bend, while Amara walked beside him. At the narrowest turn, they changed which hand held the handle, keeping both bodies faced along the path. The empty weave brushed fennel, but did not touch water. On the way back, they tried the same turn with the second basket nested inside it. That arrangement was awkward, so they decided the baskets would travel separately. "A useful failure while they weigh nothing," Aaron said. Leela marked the narrow turn with a flat stone at the path's outer edge. The stone was not a warning of danger. It was a reminder to change hands before reaching the place. Amara appreciated how little preparation was required once they stopped asking the morning to support one continuous sweep. They checked themselves as well as the ground. Aaron's boot soles were free of clay. Leela's shoes were suitable for the stone landing, but not the low hollow, so her role would remain on the firm path. Amara tightened the ties at her wrists, though the damp had already passed them. They placed a dry cloth beneath the tool handles so wet wood would not roll from the bench. By the time those choices were made, the schedule's first hour had passed. Nothing had been lifted, yet they knew the gate was clear. The downstream bed was supplied. The living plants were distinguishable from fallen ones. The carrying route had been tested, and the work could be divided without risk. Amara looked at the untouched hourly line and understood that preparation had not failed to become work. It had prevented the work from becoming careless. Amara's original schedule kept tugging at her attention. By this hour, it said, the first half should already be clean. Yet the statement belonged to a morning with ordinary visibility and dry footing. She folded the page once, then again, and returned it to the oilcloth. We will not make one sweep, she said. We will make small sections. We enter only where the path holds, and we stop if the mist thickens. Aaron moved the two baskets apart so neither would tempt them to overload it. Leela set 4 pale stones in a row beneath the eave, one for each possible section, Amara thought. Though they had not traced the exact boundaries yet. The choice changed the morning at once. There was no distant lower end they had to reach by a certain hour. There was only the first firm place, the water beneath it, and the few stems close enough to examine. Muted light rested on everything equally. Amara listened to the current continue under the fennel, and felt the work become its actual size. Under the eave, drops began a slow rhythm against the empty pail. None fell at an even interval. Amara noticed that without trying to count them, the morning offered measures everywhere: water level, firm ground, visible distance, and none of the useful ones resembled the hours on her page. They began by tracing rather than clearing. Aaron lowered the narrow rake into the water with its teeth turned upward, using the smooth back to feel beneath the stems. Amara walked on the parallel path and watched for each place the current emerged. Leela remained near the landing, passing marker stones and recording their calls on the dry side of Amara's schedule. The first manageable reach ran from the upper bend to the shallow grate. Its bank was packed with small gravel and held their boots without shine or give. 6 stems lay there, only 2 of them broken. Water slipped through the grate in 3 even ribbons. The second reach began after a stone step and ended where the channel curved around a fennel bed. The inside of the curve was too damp to stand on, but the outer path was firm. Aaron could reach every stalk from there with the rake. Amara placed the second pale stone beside the first. The third reach was the shortest and wettest. It crossed a low hollow where mist collected on the grass and joined into drops. They would have to wait before working there. They could inspect it from a flat stepping stone, however, and the view showed only 4 stems against a brush grate. The fourth reach extended into the first edge of Lavender End. Its path was broad, its blockage scattered, and its outlet visible. A thin stream continued below it toward the lower terraces. When Amara crouched beside the outlet, she saw the channel wet from wall to wall. Leela carried a small cup down the terrace steps. At the lowest bed, she held it beneath the feeder lip and waited. Water entered with a soft, unbroken sound. She returned with the cup nearly full and a dark crescent on one sleeve. Enough for the bed, she said. Not its fullest morning drink, but enough. Amara dipped a finger into the cup. The water carried no mud and only 1 fennel seed. Floating like a narrow green boat, the lowest bed did not need rescuing. Its leaves were damp from the mist as well as fed from beneath. They gave each reach a second look. In the first, the urgent work was the pair of softened stems touching the grate. In the second, no stem pressed hard against anything. In the third, the grate deserved brushing once the footing improved. In the fourth, scattered stalks could wait until the upper reaches were clear. Separating those facts made the whole task calmer. Amara drew the channel with one finger on the damp stone landing. She did not try to make a proper map. A curved line stood for water. 4 short strokes crossed it at the boundaries they had chosen. Aaron placed a fennel seed at the upper bend, another at the curve, a third in the hollow, and the last at lavender edge. The boundaries are places to stop, Amara said. Not places where the water stops. Not places where the water stops. Leela moved her cup along the drawn line. And this continues through all 4. That was why they could work in sections. Each cleared reach would remain connected to the others, and the current would show whether their actions caused any change below. They did not have to open a long dry channel all at once. They only had to preserve the passing thread while removing what lay across it. Aaron checked the rake against the first distance. From the gravel shelf, its handle reached the farthest softened stem, with room for both hands. At Fennel Curve it reached from the outer path, but not from the inside, confirming their approach. At Low Hollow the tool could support a stalk, though fingers would be needed at the grate. Lavender Edge offered room for the rake and basket side by side. Leela assigned the folded cloth to sorting rather than drying hands. She spread it on the highest stone beneath the eave, and weighted its corners with pebbles. Sound stems would lie lengthwise there. Bruised pieces would go directly to the mulch basket. That separation meant they would not have to handle everything again at the end merely to discover what could be saved. They agreed on simple calls. Holdick meant keep a stem at its present height. Lower meant return its weight to the water without releasing it. Cleart meant the last caught branch was free. If visibility shortened beyond the next marker, anyone could say Eve, and all 3 would withdraw by the broad route. The words were ordinary enough to remember and distinct enough not to confuse. Amara had once disliked stating arrangements that seemed obvious. On a clear morning, experienced hands often moved together without speech. Mist changed that. A face turned toward the channel might miss a gesture. Damp leaves could hide where another person's fingers rested. Saying the small words aloud made their gentleness possible. They practiced once with a loose stem on the cloth. Aaron raised it as if with the rake. Amara guided the middle. Leela received the crown. When Amara said lower, they returned it without dropping or twisting. The rehearsal lasted less than a minute, and made them laugh at the solemnity of moving a harmless stalk over dry stone. But afterward each knew how the others would respond over water. The lowest bed remained part of their round. Leela placed the cup under its feeder a second time while Amara watched the surface upstream. The fill took no longer than before. Mist had wet the leaves from above, but the channel continued feeding the roots below. No urgent priority emerged to overrule the safe order they had chosen. Amara emptied the cup into the soil beside the feeder, rather than carrying it back uphill again. The dark patch spread only a little beyond the ordinary dampness. Enough, and not too much, she said. On the return, she noticed how the 4 pale marker stones gathered moisture at different rates. The first 2 lay beneath the eave and remained almost chalky. The outer pair had darkened at their exposed edges. Their appearance could not serve as a clock or a measure of progress. Only turning them deliberately would do that. She liked the clarity of that rule. Mist could alter color, distance, footing, and time. It could not turn a stone on their behalf. Amara rewrote the page in 4 plain lines. Upper bend, Fennel Curve, Low Hollow, Lavender Edge. She left the hours beside them for the moment, though they already seemed less useful than the names. Under each line she drew a small square for clearing and another for checking flow. Aaron touched the first marker stone. This one is ready. He touched the second. Probably ready from the outer path. His finger passed over the third. This one decides later. This one decides later. Then the fourth. And this one waits without harm. Ha! Leela returned the cup's water to the channel. A sensible committee. A sensible committee. Aaron braced one boot on gravel and lifted the first softened stem with the rake. Amara caught it in both gloved hands and let the channel drain from its leaves before placing it across the basket. The wet fennel released a deeper sweetness when moved. It clung to her gloves and rose each time her sleeve brushed her face. They did not pull against resistance. When a fine branch caught in the grate, Amara followed it to the point of contact and freed it with 2 fingers. Aaron held the weight steady. The branch came loose without jerking, and the water beneath it widened by a finger's breadth. The second softened stem broke where it had already bruised. They gathered both pieces immediately. Amara ran the brush lightly across the grate, not forcing its bristles into the openings. A fringe of leaves lifted free. The 3 ribbons of water became one shallow sheet. Then they stopped. The stop was part of the work, not an absence from it. They carried the soft pieces to a separate basket for garden mulch, rinsed the brush in a pail, and looked back at the ground they had used. Their boot marks remained crisp rather than filling with water. The bank had held. At the fennel curve, Aaron stayed on the outer path as planned. He slid the rake under an intact stalk and raised it until Amara could take the middle. The stalk was taller than she was, and surprisingly light once the water fell away. Its green surface bent without splitting. "Drying bundle," Leela said from the landing. Amara laid it beside the basket rather than across it. They removed 2 more in the same manner. The smaller fragments went into the basket, while the intact stems rested parallel on the cloth. Clearing had already begun to sort itself into useful material and spent material. The mist thickened before they reached the end of the second section. Lavender end disappeared. Droplets gathered on Amara's eyelashes. Aaron could no longer see the pale marker stones from the curve, so he set the rake down at once. They returned to the eave along the broad path. Leela poured warm herb water from a flask into 3 cups. No one described the pause as a delay. They stood with damp sleeves near the wrists and warmth around their fingers, listening to water pass through the part they had opened. When the gray eased, they inspected rather than assuming. The first reach remained clear. The second reach outer path still held. The low hollow still shone too brightly to enter. Amara checked the lowest bed again by sight. Its feeder lip continued its quiet pour. The 4 sections gave the day a shape that weather could not ruin. One was complete, one was partly cleared, one was waiting, and one was safe to leave. None of those states was failure. Amara turned the first pale stone over, revealing its darker, wet underside, and smiled at the simple mark of progress. The intact stems beside the cloth became awkward before they became useful. Their feathery tops tangled whenever the basket moved, and their long hollow lengths rolled toward the damp edge. Amara began arranging them again, but Aaron picked up the longest and tested its bend between his hands. Aaron bent what looked like channel debris into a fragrant ring. He worked slowly, keeping his thumbs on the smooth outer curve of the intact fennel stem. The stalk gave with a faint series of dry green ticks, but did not split. Its leaves brushed his damp sleeve and released a sweetness warmer than the mist. They had removed the stem from the lower channel during maintenance at the fennel curve. It was sound from end to end, too useful for mulch, but too long to carry comfortably in the woven baskets. Aaron overlapped its narrow tip with its thicker base and secured them with one loose turn of soft cord. "Not tight," he said. "It needs air." He lowered the ring inside an empty basket. It opened gently against the woven sides, holding the mouth round instead of letting the damp rim sag inward. Then he tucked the feathery end over the edge. The basket stood ready to receive more stems without crushing them into a wet knot. Amara lifted it by both handles. The ring stayed in place. What had blocked the water now made a light drying frame, and the fennel could travel open to the air. Leela examined the join and brought the cord tin closer. She cut several lengths, each long enough for one loose turn, and draped them over the handle of the second basket. If the rest bend like that, you have solved the carrying before it became another task. They tested a second stem. This one was shorter, so Aaron made a wider overlap. Amara held the base while he guided the tip. Its ring fitted the smaller basket and lifted the rim away from the damp contents already inside. The method changed how they sorted. Broken, bruised pieces went flat in the mulch basket. Whole stems were drained, checked for soft spots, and curved while they were still supple. Fine, clean leaves were tucked loosely within the rings. Seed heads rested across the top where air could move around them. Amara liked that the method required no hurried decision about final use. The sound stems could dry under the eave. Later they might send to storage shelf, kindle a cook fire, or lend their seeds to Leela's baking. Today they needed only to be carried without waste. Aaron made a third ring from a stalk lifted at the end of the second reach. It bent less willingly. He stopped at the first sharp complaint from the fibers, straightened it, and laid it with the bundle instead. The discovery was a method, not a rule. Some stems preferred to remain long. They completed the fennel curve with this new rhythm: lift, drain, inspect, sort. The verbs were modest and repeatable. Amara stood on the outer path. Aaron worked the rake from the stone, and Leela received the material on the cloth. No one stepped onto the wet inside bank. At the last stalk, a cluster of seeds shook loose and dotted the water. Amara watched them pass the newly open curve. They did not gather at the grate. The current carried them separately, a few harmless flecks in a clear run. Aaron brushed the grate from above. A lace of fine fennel leaves came away on the bristles. He tapped them into the mulch basket and brushed once more. The water's sound lowered after the obstruction left, becoming less splash and more continuous slide. Leela turned over the second marker stone. Two dark undersides now faced upward. The low hollow remained pale. The lavender edge remained pale. The row did not urge them forward. It merely told the truth. They carried the first open basket beneath the eave. Air entered through its round mouth. Droplets gathered at the lowest points of the woven reeds and fell onto the stone, leaving small dark stars. Aaron set two straight stems across wooden pegs so they would not bow under their own wetness. Amara smelled her gloves. Fennel sweetness had worked through the damp leather. It mingled with the mineral scent of mist and the faint lavender rising from below. The morning's debris had become a set of orderly possibilities: mulch pieces, drying rings, straight bundles, clean leaves. They ate half a biscuit each while waiting for the low hollow. Leela had baked the fennel seeds into thin rounds with crisp edges. The flavor arrived quietly after the first bite. Amara put the other half back in the tin for evening. The mist moved in almost invisible changes. A line of lavender appeared below, vanished, and appeared again. The grass in the low hollow stopped shining as a single surface and returned to separate blades. Aaron walked to the stepping stone, pressed the rake handle against the bank, and found it firmer than before. Amara did not call the section ready on that evidence alone. They waited another few minutes, then tested the approach with increasing weight: rake handle, toe, flat boot, full stance. The earth compressed slightly but did not slide. They planned positions before lifting anything. The useful ring sat inside the empty basket at their backs. Its roundness made the opening easy to find without looking. As they began the next section, Amara could pass an intact stem behind her and know that Leela had room to settle it gently. A small discovery had removed a small difficulty, which was exactly enough. The low hollow asked for the narrowest movements of the day. Amara remained on the stepping stone. Aaron worked from the upper edge with one knee on a dry board Leela brought from the eave. Leela stayed on the path and managed the baskets. Their positions formed a careful triangle around the water. The first two stems lifted cleanly. The third had threaded its leaves through the brush grate. Aaron supported the stalk while Amara loosened one spray at a time. Cold water touched the heel of her glove. She paused whenever the stem hid her view and waited for the current to lay the leaves flat again. A heavier veil of mist crossed the hollow. The far edge blurred. Amara withdrew her hand. Aaron lowered the stalk so it could not swing, and all three returned to the eave. The half-freed stem stayed safely supported in the channel. They had left it in a better position, not a dangerous one. During the pause, Amara unfolded her schedule. The hourly targets looked increasingly strange. They implied that the first and second reaches had taken too long, although both were completely clean and had yielded useful bundles. They implied that the low hollow should be finished now, although the ground itself had twice asked them to wait. For a while she left the pencil tucked into the fold. She could see what needed changing, but she wanted the change to come from the work rather than from impatience with the page. The low hollow was half cleared. Its third stem remained supported against the grate, and the fourth lay downstream where it could do no harm. That was the present fact. The paper could wait as readily as the ground. Leela spread the folded cloth across the bench and lifted each saved stem from the basket long enough to inspect the place where it had rested. Moisture darkened the reeds beneath them, but the fennel itself was not heating or softening. She returned the curved stems with their joins uppermost and laid the straight ones across the pegs. The small tending made the pause useful without disguising it as channel work. Aaron rinsed the narrow rake. A thread of leaf had wound around one wooden tooth, and he eased it loose rather than scraping it against the pail. "This mist has a patient way of entering everything," he said. "Sleeves first," Leela said. Amara pinched her cuff. A cold drop ran into her palm. "Schedules second." They smiled, and the mist thickened enough to hide the low hollow altogether. Water remained audible beyond the eave, a subdued sliding under the fennel. Amara could distinguish the clean upper bend from the curve by sound now. The bend made a thin, continuous slip. The curve gave the current a rounded hush against stone. Below both came the softer, irregular note of water working through the half-cleared brush grate. She listened until the sound ceased to feel like demands. Earlier, every unfamiliar note would have sent her toward the channel to confirm it. Now she knew what each one meant and where it belonged. The hollow was passing water. The lowest bed was receiving enough. The supported stalk was stable. Waiting added no danger. Leela poured the last of the warm herb water, dividing it evenly among the cups. The fennel biscuits stayed covered. Their baked sweetness would have been pleasant, but Amara wanted to keep hers for the end of the flush, when there would be nothing left for its taste to interrupt. The gray outside slowly acquired depth. First the eave's outer post appeared, then the line of the broad path. Then the stepping stone returned as a darker oval among wet grass. The grass still shone, so they did not move. Aaron placed the dry board at the approach, but kept his hands off the rake. Visible is not the same as ready. Seed. Amara looked at the 4 stones. Too dark. Too pale. No. But it is a beginning. They waited until individual grass blades could be seen instead of a single silver surface. Aaron tested from the path with the smooth end of the rake. The top layer yielded, then held. Leela watched the mark after he lifted the handle. No water gathered in it. Amara tried the edge of the board with one boot, then placed her full foot on it. The board remained level. They returned to the low hollow in the same positions as before. Amara stood on the stepping stone. Aaron knelt above the supported stem, and Leela kept the ringed basket within reach from firm ground. None of them needed to discuss the arrangement again. Their bodies found the careful triangle they had already made. The half-breed spray lay flatter than before because the current had combed its leaves downstream. That helped Amara see where 3 fine branches still crossed the grate. Aaron raised the stalk only enough to remove its weight. Amara freed the upper branch and laid it along the water. The second had doubled through one opening. She passed its tip backward rather than pulling the feathery crown forward. It slipped loose and opened in the current like a small green fan. The third branch resisted. Amara stopped. She moved her wrist, changed the angle of her fingers, and felt the branch hidden fork. As she tugged, the fine stem would break and leave half of itself behind the grate. She asked Aaron to lower the main stalk the width of a finger. The pressure eased. The fork came back through intact. "Clear," she said. Aaron lifted. Water streamed from the hollow stem and tapped against the grate. Amara supported the middle while Leela took the flowering end. Together they placed it through the round mouth of the basket. It bent naturally along the fennel ring without needing a tie. They looked into the channel before reaching for the final stalk. Water occupied all but the lowest slots of the grate. A fringe of bruised leaves remained along one edge, and a small pocket of foam trembled above it. The last fallen stalk lay below, soft at its base, but otherwise free. Aaron brought it toward the stepping stone with the rake's smooth back. Amara caught the thick end, the base folded in her hand, releasing the smell of fennel more strongly than any sound stem had. Its inner fibers had turned brown. She held both parts when it separated and passed them to Leela for the mulch basket. Not a piece fell back. Only then did Amara take the brush. She worked from the top of the grate downward, one light pass at a time. Leela held the pail beneath the brush whenever Amara lifted it, receiving wet threads of leaf. Aaron watched the bank and the waterline. The first pass opened 2 lower slots. The second removed the fringe. On the third, the bristles came back clean. Water spread through the whole grate. The little pocket of foam lengthened, divided, and passed. Amara kept watching for a count of 10, then another. No new leaf arrived. No hidden stem shifted upstream. "The hollow is clear," Aaron said. Amara stepped backward onto the board before answering. Firm footing came before celebration. Even a celebration as small as turning a stone. Leela carried the brush to the pail. Aaron lifted the board. Its underside was damp, but its corners had not sunk. At the eave, Leela turned the third marker dark side up. 3 dark stones made the remaining pale one look distinct, rather than overdue. Lavender edge was not an accumulation of all the morning's unfinished time. It was simply the 4th reach. Amara checked the low hollow square on the schedule. She did not write an hour beside it. Instead, she noted, "Firm after second thinning." The phrase held the information she might need on another misty morning. A time alone would have held almost none. They emptied the pail onto the mulch patch and rinsed it. Aaron examined the board for clinging soil before carrying it back under the eave. Leela rearranged the baskets, sound-curved stems in the ringed one, broken stems in the mulch basket, straight stalks on the cloth. Each container had room left. They would not need to carry an overfilled load down the broad path. The pause after the hollow felt different from the pauses before it. The mist was no thinner, and their sleeves were no drier. But 3 reaches now ran without fallen stems. Amara could feel the old schedule trying to convert that fact into a calculation. 3 completed, 1 remaining, so the pace should increase. She folded the page before the thought could dress itself as instruction. Lavender edge began below a shoulder of stone where the path widened. They approached on the terrace route rather than following the wet channel bank. The longer way kept them on packed ground. Aaron carried the rake and empty ringed basket. Leela carried the brush and cord. Amara carried nothing for the first part of the descent, so that she could test the path and point out places where lavender leaned across it. Muted light lay blue on the stones. The lavender rows were gray-violet under beads of mist, and their scent rose only when a sleeve brushed them. Fennel's sweetness traveled with the baskets. Between the 2 fragrances, the air seemed divided into a warm upper note and a cool lower one. At the start of the reach, Amara set the basket on a flat stone and walked the parallel path without touching the channel. The scattered stems were easier to count here because they lay at intervals. 2 before the first small grate, 5 beyond it, 1 balanced between the banks, and 3 near the lower dip. A separate fan of fennel leaves clung to the grate. Nothing crossed the outlet. Aaron counted again from the stone side. Their totals agreed. Leela placed 11 short lengths of cord over the basket handle. Not because every stalk would make a ring, but because the visible pieces now had a simple tally. For each fallen stem removed, she would shift 1 cord to the other handle. If a stalk broke, its pieces would still count as the 1 stem they had seen. And if we discover a 12th? She asked. We remove 12, Amara said. The cords describe what we can see. They do not forbid the channel from telling us more. The first 2 stems rested in shallow water beside firm stone. Aaron slid the rake beneath the farther one while Amara took the nearer by its middle. They lifted together, preventing either set of leaves from tangling with the other. Water fell in fine lines from the feathery crowns. 1 stalk was sound enough to remain straight. The other had a bruised joint and folded when Leela inspected it. She moved 2 cords. The sound stalk went across the basket mouth for carrying to the pegs. The bruised one lay flat in the mulch basket. Amara looked back at the places they had occupied. Brown pebbles showed through clear water. No smaller branch remained underneath. At the first small grate, the bank was firm on the stone side and glossy beneath the lavender. They stayed on stone. Aaron held the basket near enough to receive leaves but not above the current. Amara brushed from the grate center outward, guiding the fennel fan toward the path side. The leaves peeled away in a single wet lace, then broke into 3 pieces over the pail. She brushed each corner once more. The flush of ordinary water through the exposed slots made a momentary brighter sound. It settled almost at once. They waited to see whether another fan had been held behind the first. None appeared. 3 cords moved to the cleared side of the handle. 2 stems and the grate fan did not count as another stem, so Leela moved only the 2. She tucked the loose leaves into the mulch basket and left the tally honest. The mist drifted sideways for the first time that day. It was not wind exactly. The fennel tops barely moved. Yet a pale wall crossed lavender end, hiding the lower dip while leaving the grate visible. Amara could have kept working where she stood, but they would have lost sight of the route back to the basket. She raised one hand. Aaron set down the rake. Leela covered the pail. They withdrew to the shoulder of stone and sat on the low wall. The pause came before danger and therefore felt almost uneventful. Amara watched droplets accumulate on the woven basket. Each reed darkened along its lower curve. The fennel ring held the damp rim open, exactly as Aaron had intended. "Your frame works better each time the basket gets wetter," Leela said. Aaron pressed the rim gently. It returned to round, a fortunate property in a damp place. They did not fill the interval with another task. Their hands rested. Amara rolled her shoulders and discovered how much the wet sleeves had weighed on them. Leela loosened the cloth at her neck. Aaron extended one leg, then the other. Rest, Amara thought, was also a condition of the work. Ground could be ready while hands were not. Below, the lowest feeder continued to pour. They could hear it when the nearer channel sound softened under mist. Leela identified the note without standing. "Still enough," she said. The assurance required no new cup measurement. They had measured earlier, and nothing upstream had worsened. Amara let the earlier evidence remain valid. Rechecking every fact merely because time had passed could become another kind of hurry, a refusal to trust what the morning had already shown. When the sideways veil passed, the lower path returned in pieces. Lavender tips appeared first, then stones, then the dull line of packed soil. Amara finished resting before she stood. She tested the broad path with her boot and found it firm. The patch beneath the plants remained slick, so she marked it with a pale pebble where everyone could see. They resumed beyond the grate. 5 stems lay in the open run, but their leaves had tangled together into one loose raft. Pulling the nearest would have tightened the rest. Aaron used the rake to separate the flowering tips while Amara held the upstream ends in place. Leela stood beside the baskets and called when a crown came free. The first stem slid out intact. Its green length was too stiff for a ring, so it joined the straight bundle. The second had split near the center. Amara lifted both halves together and checked the water for loose fibers. The third and fourth crossed each other. Aaron raised the upper one, and Amara turned the lower a quarter circle until its branch cleared. The fifth was little more than a seed head and hollow length, light enough for Leela to receive with one hand. 5 cords crossed the handle. 7 of the 11 visible stems were now removed. The raft had looked like a single large obstruction from uphill, but water had passed freely among its loose branches. Once lifted, it proved to be 5 manageable objects, each asking for a slightly different motion. They sorted on the flat stone. 2 straight stems rested beside the first. One supple stalk curved into a ring for the second basket. Aaron overlapped the ends loosely and let Amara tie the cord. She left room for one finger under the knot, remembering his instruction that the stem needed air. The split and weathered pieces went to mulch. Leela shook no seed heads. She ran her palm beneath them instead, catching loose seeds on the cloth. A few escaped into the channel when the stems were lifted, but they floated singly and went through the clean grate. The cloth held a small, fragrant scatter that could dry beside the stems. Amara crouched on the stone side and checked the floor where the raft had lain. A pale shape beneath the surface looked at first like another stem. Aaron touched it with the smooth back of the rake. It did not move. The mist shifted, and the shape resolved into a vein of quartz in a brown stone. "The channel has offered its 12th, he said. "It can keep that one," Amara answered. Leela left the remaining cords where they were. Their tally changed only for fallen fennel, not for every narrow thing the muted light made uncertain. The balanced stem came next. It arched from bank to bank and scarcely touched the current. Its position made it look structural, though it bore nothing but its own wet leaves. Amara examined both ends before anyone lifted it. One rested on a stone. The other had caught in living lavender without breaking it. Aaron supported the middle. Amara freed the lavender sprig leaf by leaf. The rooted plant rose when the fennel's weight left it. shedding droplets onto her glove. Leela took the fallen stem by its thick end. It was dry enough inside to make a hollow knock against the basket ring. It looked important, Erin said. It chose an important-looking place, Leela replied. They laughed quietly. Amara checked the banks. Neither had depended on the stalk. Water beneath showed no change because the stem had never obstructed it. Some pieces needed removal simply because the task was to clear fallen fennel, not because every piece had created a crisis. 8 cords had crossed the handle. 3 stems remained near the lower dip. From the broad path they could see one whole stalk, one broken near its flowerhead, and one half submerged along the channel wall. The ground between them and those stems still shone under a layer of water draining from the lavender. They did not test it immediately. The shine itself was enough. They returned the full ringed basket to the stone shoulder, carrying it between Amara and Erin. Leela walked beside them and kept the straight stems from catching on lavender. At the grate, they changed hands without turning toward the water. The ring prevented the wet basket from closing around its contents. Under the eave, they unloaded before the final round. Straight stems went across the pegs with space between them. Ringed stems remained in the baskets, their joins facing up. The mulch pieces settled loosely rather than being pressed down. Leela counted the cords on both handles and returned the 3 unshifted links to the working side. Amara's schedule lay where she had left it. Its hourly lines now seemed less like instructions than like a row of doors she had been trying to enter, after the rooms behind them had changed. Sunrise was gone. Mid-morning was gone. Noon had passed somewhere inside the mist without announcing itself. The flush would happen when the channel was clear, not when a line of ink claimed the afternoon. Still, she did not take up the pencil. 3 stems remained. The schedule's revision would mean more after the work had demonstrated its own complete shape. Leela opened the biscuit tin but did not offer it. After the last reach? After the flush, Amara said. Erin chose a cup of cool water instead. They drank, chose a cup of cool water instead. They drank, rinsed their gloves, and turned their sleeves back down. The fabric was still damp, but the brief exposure to air had warmed their wrists. From below came the steady channel note, altered now by 3 clear reaches and most of a 4th. The mist began thinning from above. The sky did not brighten so much as acquire a blue-gray color distinct from the terraces. Fennel crowns emerged along the upper bank. At Lavender End, the path lost its glaze in patches, beginning near the stones and spreading toward the packed center. They carried only what the final round required: rake, brush, mulch basket, and 1 open basket. The cord tally remained looped over its handle, Amara led by the broad root. Their earlier footprints had kept crisp edges. No print held standing water. At the lower dip, they waited on stone for another few minutes. Water drained from the grass in threads no thicker than hair. Each thread crossed the path and entered the channel. Amara watched the spaces between them lengthen. Erin tested the path above the dip, then below it. Both held. The center remained soft, so they planned to reach from opposite ends rather than cross it. The whole stalk lay nearest Erin. He slid the rake under its center and lifted until water drained from both ends. Amara received it from the upper stone without stepping into the dip. It had a firm green base and an unbroken crown. She passed it to Leela, who laid it across the open basket for straight drying. The broken stalk lay with its flowering half upstream and its base against the wall. Erin brought the loose crown toward him. Amara kept sight of the base. When the 2 halves separated, each remained supported. They lifted them in turn and placed both in mulch. The channel wall underneath was clean. 1 cord remained. Half-submerged stem had settled so close to the wall that muted light disguised it as a shadow. Amara approached from below on a flat stone. She could see its seed head, but not its base. Aaron touched the upper end with the rake. The stalk shifted freely, except at one point beneath an overhanging lavender branch. Amara moved the living branch aside. A cluster of droplets ran down her damp sleeve. Beneath it, the fallen fennel had hooked around a small stone, not a root. She asked Aaron to roll the stalk toward the center. The hook opened. Current entered the narrow space along the wall. Aaron drew the stem upward. Age had hollowed its base, and it broke softly in the middle. Amara caught the lower piece before it drifted. She ran 2 fingers along the wall, then looked downstream for the seed head. Leela received both halves and placed them side by side in the mulch basket. The last cord crossed to the cleared handle. They remained where they were and looked again. The dip held only water, stones, and the reflections of living lavender. Aaron passed the rake's smooth back along the channel wall. It touched no hidden stalk. Amara watched the outlet. The current reached it without hesitation. There was one final small grate below the dip. Fine leaves lay against 2 slots, not enough to slow the flow but part of the debris they had come to remove. Amara could reach it from the flat stone. She brushed outward while Leela held the pail. One pass gathered the leaves. A second returned clean. Water divided evenly across the metal. They carried the last material back by the firm root. No one suggested a faster path now that only a few minutes of clearing remained. The ground received the same respect at the end that it had at the beginning. At the shoulder, Leela set the mulch basket down and counted the shifted cords once more. 11 visible stems, 11 removed. The unexpected material had been leaves, not a hidden 12th stalk. At the eave, she turned the 4th marker stone. 4 dark undersides faced upward in a row. Amara walked one final inspection from the parallel path. She did not repeat the work or search for reasons to distrust it. At upper bend, brown pebbles showed through the clear run and the first grate accepted a thin sheet. Fennel curve held no tangled crowns, and its brushed openings made a continuous low sound. Low hollow spread water across every slot. Lavender edge carried the current past the empty places where 11 stems had lain. Living fennel and lavender still leaned naturally over the banks. Fallen stems did not cross the water anywhere. Aaron watched the channel floor at each reach while Leela checked the baskets and tally. Their 3 views met at the lower outlet. No surface backed up. No leaf trembled against a grate. And no broken length hid under the bank. The inspection was brief because the work had been observed throughout, not saved for one anxious reckoning at the end. Amara crossed out every hour on her work schedule. One line went through sunrise, another through mid-morning, another through noon, and the last through the time she had once assigned to the flush. The mist had made a continuous cleaning plan impractical. Those hours described a dry path and an uninterrupted sweep, neither of which had existed. She left the 4 named sections untouched. Beside upper bend, fennel curve, low hollow, and lavender edge, every clearing box was checked. 4 dark marker stones stood beneath the eave. The hours were measuring a day we did not get, she said. Aaron looked from the crossed lines to the open channel. The reaches measured the one we did. Working only when each section of ground was ready had brought them comfortably to the same complete end. Every fallen stem was out, every grate was brushed, and the entire channel lay clean for its flush. Not one hourly target had survived, and nothing that mattered had been left unfinished. The crossing out did not feel like erasure. The useful parts of the page became easier to see. Amara added a small note beneath the sections. Ground readiness after mist. She wrote it as a condition observed, not an excuse offered. When they returned to the half-reed stem, its leaves came from the grate with 3 patient movements. Aaron lifted. Amara guided. Leela received. The intact length curved into another ring. The last stem in the hollow was too soft to save, so it went to mulch. They brushed the hollow grate from the stepping stone. The brush collected a thin green fringe and nothing more. Water spread evenly across its slots. Amara leaned close enough to hear that no opening hissed or gulped. Each carried the same soft pressure. The third marker stone turned dark. Before moving on, they washed their gloves in the pail and wrung the cuffs of their sleeves. Damp fabric had crept nearly to Amara's elbows. Leela hung a spare cloth over her shoulders, and Aaron rolled his sleeves once, exposing a narrow band of dry skin. Lavender edge offered firmer ground and wider light. The mist had begun to lift above the lowest terrace, leaving a blue-gray distance behind it. Lavender plants lined the outer path, their wet heads bowed but not damaged. The channel ran beside them with scattered fennel stems lying at long intervals. Because the footing was easier, Amara felt the old temptation to recover time. She could imagine moving quickly, loading both baskets and reaching the flush close to an hour once written on the page. Then her boot found a wet patch beneath lavender leaves. She stopped without resentment and called it out. They shifted to the stone side. Aaron lifted a stem. Amara drained it. Leela settled it inside the ring. The simple rhythm returned, indifferent to the clock. The missed hourly target had nothing useful to say about a hidden wet patch. At the first small grate, they found fennel leaves plastered in a fan. Amara brushed from the center outward so the current would not pack them into the corners. Aaron held the basket near but not over the water. Each brushstroke exposed another line of dark metal. They paused after the grate, though the mist had not thickened. Rest was one of the conditions worth following, too. Beneath the eave, they drank warm herb water and listened to droplets leave the basket rims. Leela rotated the drying rings a quarter turn so their joins faced upward. The next round cleared 5 scattered stems. 2 were intact enough to bundle straight. 1 made a ring. 2 had bruised where they struck stones and went to mulch. Amara checked the channel floor after each lift. No hidden branch remained pinned under a rock. Farther down, the lavender scent joined the fennel. It was less sweet and more woody in the damp, a steady background beneath the bright note released by every moved stalk. Muted light showed no hard shadows. Their hands, tools, and baskets seemed to belong to the same quiet palette. Aaron found a stem balanced between both banks, scarcely touching the water. "It looks important," he said. "Does it?" Alila asked. "It has chosen the most theatrical position." Amara laughed, then assessed it with the same care as the others. It was not bearing weight and not holding debris. Aaron lifted it from the broad path. The channel beneath did not change at all. Some clutter was merely clutter. Near the end of Lavender Edge, the lower path dipped. They waited while water from the grass drained in tiny threads. Amara used the time to walk the completed reaches from the parallel path. Upper Bend was open. Fenny Curve ran clear. Low hollow spread water evenly through its brushed grate. She did not add imagined work to make the day feel more complete. A pebble resting in the channel could remain a pebble. A living fennel stalk leaning over the bank could remain rooted. They were removing fallen stems, not polishing the reach into an unnatural emptiness. When the dip had firmed, they approached from opposite sides. Aaron used the rake to bring the last fallen stalk within reach. Amara lifted it by the middle and found its base already hollowed by age. It broke softly, without splintering. Both pieces fit in the mulch basket. They inspected the full fourth section twice. On the first pass, they looked at the surface, checking banks, grates, and visible stones. On the second, they followed the current, watching for hesitation. The water narrowed naturally at the bends and widened in the shallow places. It did not gather behind anything. Leela turned the fourth marker stone. The row beneath the eave was entirely dark now. Nearby, the drying baskets held their round mouths open. Straight stems lay on pegs. The mulch basket was full but not heavy enough to strain its handles. All 4 reaches were clean. The statement was quiet and exact. It did not matter that the work had been divided by mist, warm drinks, tests of footing, and unhurried returns. Those divisions had made completion possible. They rested before the flush. Amara knew that completion of clearing was not yet completion of the task. The lower branch needed a gentle release, and they needed to follow it through Lavender End. Still, there was no reason to carry the pace of lifting into the verification. Aaron checked the small gate at the upper bend. No fennel had lodged beneath its edge. He cleaned the groove with the narrow end of the brush, then opened the gate only a finger's width. Water thickened behind it and entered the cleared channel without a rush. Amara watched the first swell pass the place where the beaded stem had lain that morning. The surface rose against the stones, smoothed, and continued. It carried 2 fennel seeds and a fragment of leaf no larger than her thumbnail. They followed on the parallel path. At the first grate, the water spread into an even sheet. Aaron counted the visible slots while Amara watched the downstream side. No leaves caught. The faint fringe they had brushed away did not return. At the fennel curve, the flush leaned against the outer wall and rounded it cleanly. 1 seed circled in a tiny eddy, then found the main thread and moved on. Leela walked below them, listening at the feeder lips of the beds. "Even here," she called. Amara answered with a raised hand. Speech carried strangely in the thinning mist. Near sounds softened and distant ones made unexpectedly clear. A droplet fell from a fennel flower head beside her and struck a leaf below with a small hollow tap. The low hollow accepted the flush without pooling. Water passed through every part of the brush grate. Amara crouched on the stepping stone and watched the downstream surface settle. It held a few harmless seeds, nothing that could block a slot or weigh down a branch. They continued toward Lavender End at the water's pace. This was slower than their walking pace, so they stopped often. The return path became a sequence of listening places, beside a narrow stone, below a feeder, at the turn where lavender roots held the bank. Leela touched the soil of the lowest bed. Moisture darkened it evenly. The earlier reduced flow had been enough, and the flush now completed its watering without flooding the lip. She crumbled a small surface clod between her fingers and nodded. At the broad edge, the current found the newly empty spaces where stems had rested. It made no dramatic leap. It simply occupied the full width available to it. Amara preferred that evidence to any sense of having conquered the obstruction. Aaron walked a few steps ahead to check the outlet. "Clear to Lavender End," he said. Amara waited until the same water reached her. 3 seeds passed, spaced far apart. Then came a clean stretch reflecting the blue-gray sky. She followed it around the final bend. The lower terraces received their flow in equal shallow ribbons. Leela moved from feeder to feeder, looking for a weak branch. Aaron stayed by the main run. Amara stood where she could see both the channel and the resting pool below. No branch lagged. No bed took more than its share. The gentle gate opening had been sufficient to rinse loose leaves without scouring the banks. Amara wrote a check beside each section's flow box. though the marks were already there. She darkened them so the damp paper would keep the record. They began the return along the same path, closing the temporary flush behind them. Aaron lowered the gate to its ordinary setting. The channel settled from its fuller run to the steady daily flow. They followed again briefly to make sure the change did not expose some hidden snag. It did not. Upper bend remained open. Fennel curve remained smooth, low hollow divided evenly. Lavender edge carried a clear thread from end to end. The only travelers were occasional fennel seeds, too few and too light to matter. Amara picked one seed from the surface at the edge of the resting pool and rolled it between finger and thumb. Its scent was faint until the husk cracked. Then sweetness rose even in the cool air. She let the broken seed fall into the mulch basket rather than back into the water. The practical work had reached its closure in layers. Every fallen stem was out. Useful stems were ringed or bundled. The grates were brushed. The branch had been flushed. The lower terraces held an even completed flow. Each statement rested on something they had seen rather than something the schedule had predicted. Leela took the lower path to listen at the last feeder once more. Aaron carried the lighter drying basket. Amara carried the tools. Their sleeves were damp, their gloves fragrant, and their pace matched the quiet water beside them. By the time they reached the eave, the mist had lifted enough to show the line of reed resting pool. It lay below Lavender End like a piece of dull blue glass bordered by reeds. Evening had begun without any sharp change in light. They set everything down for cleanup. No unfinished blockage waited behind them. The return path had confirmed the whole lower branch, and the water continued on its own. The last fifth of the day arrived in smaller sounds. A basket touched stone. Cord slid around a bundle. Water poured from the rinse pail in a clear, brief arc. Beyond the eave, mist thinned into blue-gray evening, and the terraces lost even the soft distinctions they had held at noon. Amara and Aaron stacked the straight fennel stems across the wooden pegs, with a hand's width between bundles. They placed the ringed baskets below, open mouths turned toward the faint movement of air. Droplets gathered along the woven rims and fell one by one. Leela rinsed the mulch basket after emptying it beside the upper garden. Fine green leaves clung to the weave. She loosened them with her fingertips, never striking the basket against stone. When the water ran clear, she leaned it beside the others under the eave. Aaron washed the brush and narrow rake. He ran a thumb along the rake's teeth to be sure no fennel fiber remained wound there. Then he dried the wooden handles with the folded cloth and hung both tools from their pegs. Amara unfolded the schedule for the last time. The crossed-out hours were still visible, but they no longer dominated the page. The 4 named reaches and their dark checks made a truer record. Beneath them, she wrote, all stems removed, sound stems drying, grates brushed, gentle flush complete, lower flow even. She paused at the line where a completion time would normally go. Instead, she wrote, schedule changed with ground conditions. Successful. The words fitted without crowding. Leela read them over her shoulder. That seems accurate. Amara set the page under the eave until its surface lost the last damp curl. It is more accurate than pretending the old hours survived. No one needed to defend the day. The evidence hung in fragrant bundles and traveled in clear water below. The 4 marker stones remained dark side up until Aaron returned them to the wall pocket. They carried the rinse water to the mulch patch. Amara poured slowly so no soil washed away. The fennel fragments settled among older leaves. Their sweetness rose briefly, then faded into the cooler smell of earth. Back beneath the eave, Leela opened the biscuit tin. Only 3 rounds remained, one for each of them. Aaron took his to the stone landing. Leela sat on the dry end of the tool bench. Amara kept hers in her palm while she looked down the lower channel. The ordinary flow was difficult to see in the evening, but easy to hear. It slipped past the upper bend, past the clean grate, and softened at the fennel curve. Farther down, its sound mingled with droplets leaving lavender leaves. Amara walked the last flush to Reed Resting Pool alone, though Aaron and Leela remained within calling distance. She took the broad parallel path and did not hurry. The places that had shone slickly in the morning now held a dull, firm surface. At the first reach, she stopped beside the stone where she had crouched. No stem crossed the water. The current showed a narrow reflection of the sky and a darker reflection of fennel above it. A drop rolled from a living stalk and joined the flow. At the curve, the grate made almost no sound. Water passed through it without catching. The bank smelled of fennel where their gloves had brushed the plants. But the strongest sweetness now came from the drying baskets behind her. The low hollow held a faint coolness. Amara stayed on the stepping stone out of habit and respect, although the edge looked firmer. 4 clear ribbons passed the brushed grate. She counted them once and moved on. Lavender end opened below in muted rows. The plants held evening beads along their narrow leaves. Their color had withdrawn into gray-violet, more sensed than seen. The channel beside them carried the final portion of the flush toward the pool. Amara broke the fennel biscuit in half. Its edge gave with a dry snap that seemed bright after the softened sounds of the day. She tasted one half slowly. Butter and grain came first, then the clean sweetness of seed. She put the second half in her pocket and followed the water. At each feeder lip, the lower terraces received the same modest pour. Dark soil spread evenly beneath the plants. Nothing overflowed. Nothing waited dry. Aaron moved under the eave above, turning one basket so its wet side faced outward. Leela folded the rinsing cloth over the rail. Their motions were small at this distance. The day no longer needed the 3 of them gathered around one point. At the outlet, the flush entered Reed Resting Pool without disturbing its surface beyond a widening set of lines. Reeds stood close around the margin. Their stems held more droplets than the fennel had, each one suspended until its own weight became sufficient. Amara sat on the flat stone above the pool. Her sleeves were still damp at the cuffs, but the chill did not trouble her. She rested her hands loosely and listened. From the pool, the day's 4 reaches could no longer be separated by sight. The channel was a dim line entering the reeds, and the terraces above it rose in broad gray bands. The distinctions that had guided the work-firm gravel, outer curve, stepping stone, broad lavender path belonged to touch and memory now. Evening did not erase them. It simply gathered them into one completed slope. Amara set the remaining half of her biscuit on its paper in her lap. She waited for the taste of the first half to fade before eating more. Fennel lingered at the back of her tongue, warm and faintly green beneath the butter. The same sweetness came down from the eave and cooler breaths whenever the air moved. The movement was hardly enough to stir the reeds. It traveled along their tips instead, dislodging one bead here and another several stems away. Each drop made its own small root. Some fell directly into the pool. Some struck a leaf, divided, and arrived as 2 softer taps. Others slid so quietly down the reed that Amara heard only their final touch on water. She did not count them at first. The sounds did not need turning into evidence. The pool had already received the flush. The ordinary flow had followed, and the feeder lips above had all been seen running evenly. Listening now was no longer an inspection disguised as rest. It was simply what remained when inspection was finished. On the far margin, a reed bowed under gathered moisture. Its reflection bowed toward it from below until the two narrow shapes nearly met. One drop released. The reed rose a little, and the reflection broke into rings. Blue-gray light returned between them. Amara thought of the living fennel crown they had left leaning over the upper bend. By tomorrow, if the mist lifted, it too might rise. If it did not, it would still be rooted, still part of the bank, and could be assessed on its own terms. They had not turned maintenance into a wish for rigid edges. The channel could be clear without looking empty. Above her, a basket shifted lightly on stone. Aaron must have turned another damp side toward the air. The sound was followed by the quiet scrape of a peg taking the weight of a straight bundle. Then the eave became still again. He did not call down a question, and Amara did not offer a report. Both knew the practical work was closed. Leela's cloth appeared as a pale square over the rail. She shook nothing from it. She merely opened it once, let the corners settle, and folded it so the captured seeds remained inside. The small packet could dry under cover. Even at a distance, the motion was recognizable, edge to edge. Then once across, the mist withdrew unevenly. A patch above lavender end cleared enough to show 3 rows of plants, while the terrace beyond remained hidden. Along the seaside, the gray brightened without revealing the horizon. Evening was not uncovering the whole landscape. It was choosing a few quiet details and leaving the rest soft. Water entered the pool beside a low cluster of reeds. The inlet's widening lines reached Amara's reflected boot and bent it gently. She lifted her foot back from the edge, not because the stone was unsafe, but to leave the surface room to settle. Soon her reflection returned as a dark, incomplete shape. Her hands smelled more strongly of fennel when she brought them near her face. Damp leather, bruised stems, mineral water, and the biscuit shared the same small space of air. She loosened one glove but did not remove it. The cuff beneath was cool. A thin red line crossed her wrist where wet fabric had pressed all day, already fading now that the sleeve rested loosely. She could have used the quiet to reconstruct the schedule. How long the first inspection took. How many minutes belonged to mist. Whether the final flush ended before or after the hour she had crossed away. The mind offered those questions out of habit. Amara let them pass unanswered. The useful record waited dry beneath the eave. It said which conditions had shaped the work and what had been completed. Nothing tonight required a recovered timetable. A few fennel seeds had reached the pool with the flush. One floated near the inlet, turned slowly, and lodged for a moment against a reed. The next pulse of ordinary flow freed it. It moved into open water without forming a cluster. Amara watched it only because it caught the remaining light, not because she intended to retrieve it. Farther uphill, the channel's sound had become too soft to divide into reaches. At the pool, all its small notes arrived together. Water over a feeder lip, a drop from lavender, a narrow run around stone, the almost soundless spread at the inlet. Completion had a sound, she thought, but not a triumphant one. It was the absence of interruption inside many ordinary continuities. She picked up the biscuit half and broke off one corner. Crumbs rested on the paper. She touched them with a damp fingertip and ate them before they could fall. The fennel seed baked into the corner cracked between her teeth. Its brief warmth made the evening air feel cooler around her face. The flat stone retained a little of the day's warmth beneath her. She placed both palms beside her and felt it through the gloves. Moss at the stone's far edge held beads in its tiny green tips. None moved. Nearer the reeds, the surface was bare and dark from mist. For several minutes there were no voices. Erin's outline crossed once behind the eave post and disappeared. Leela remained seated on the bench, her pale cloth beside her. Their nearness did not require conversation. The work had given them enough shared attention for one day. Quiet could be shared too. Amara followed one set of widening rings until it met another. The first had begun beneath the nearest reed, the second somewhere out in the gray water. Their edges crossed, changed shape, and faded. No boundary remained to show which ring had come from which drop. The last flush behaved the same way. Its slightly fuller water entered reed resting pool and joined what was already there. Behind it, the gate's ordinary setting continued to send a modest thread. There would be no instant when the pool declared the flush finished. The distinction would soften until only the steady inflow remained. That suited the day. Their stages had been clear enough while needed. 4 reaches, dark stones, sordid stems, one gentle release, but completion did not have to preserve every boundary forever. The cleaned channel was already returning to its ordinary purpose. Water moved through it without displaying the labor that had opened the way. A droplet struck a hollow reed with a quiet wooden note. Another answered from the lavender bank. Then nothing fell for a long interval. Amara heard the faint movement of her own sleeve when she folded her hands, the small sound of the biscuit paper settling on her knee. And below both, water entering water. She looked back once. The drying baskets stood under the eave with their mouths held round by salvaged stems. In the blue-gray distance, they resembled the 2 shadows Leela had seen that morning. Now their purpose was legible even through mist. Open weave, air between stems, no wet mass pressed inward. A drop fell from one rim and darkened the stone beneath it. The straight bundles above them made sparse horizontal lines. Erin had left a hand's width between each. Feathery crowns hung beyond the pegs, no longer trailing in the channel, or tangling with one another. The useful stems would dry by waiting, just as the ground had become workable by waiting. Nothing more needed to be done to force either process. Amara finished the biscuit slowly. She folded its paper into a small square and placed it in her pocket. The sweetness remained, gentler now than the fragrance on her gloves. She drank no water to clear it away. At the inlet, the surface had nearly settled. A final broad line moved outward and disappeared among the reed reflections. After it came the narrower pulse of ordinary flow. Amara recognized the change without standing to measure it. The gate above had returned to its daily setting. The pool received exactly that quiet continuation. She let her eyes close for 3 breaths. With sight removed, droplets seemed farther apart and the channel nearer. The reeds held a faint dry rustle beneath their wet taps, though no visible wind moved them. Somewhere on the bank, a bead traveled down a lavender stem with a sequence of touches too light to locate. When she opened her eyes, the gray had deepened. The pool reflected no separate cloud, only an even dimness. Reed stems crossed it in dark strokes. The path home remained visible above the bank, firm and broad. But there was no need to take it at once. She rested until the chill in her cuffs became noticeable, then rolled each wrist gently. The motion released the fabric from her skin. She could return without hurrying. Behind her, all tools were washed, all stems assigned, all baskets rinsed. Ahead of her, all lower beds had their even share. The present moment contained no preparation for another round. A droplet left a reed and struck the pool. Another slid down a stem before falling onto a lower leaf. Farther along the margin, several drops released in quiet succession, as if the reeds were passing a message too simple to require words. The last flush spread through the resting pool and lost its separate shape. Behind it came the ordinary channel flow, steady and complete. Amara could no longer identify which water had begun at the gate and which had already been waiting here. The verification ended naturally. She thought of the morning page with its hours. Nothing in the pool preserved those divisions. The water had moved whenever the open channel and gentle gate allowed it. The ground had held when it was ready. Their work had advanced by reaches, pauses, and returns. The difference mattered because she had not treated the revised day as a damaged version of the planned one. She had let it become the day in front of her. Every required thing was finished, and no hurried step had been needed to make that true. She ate the second half of the biscuit. A fennel seed caught briefly between her teeth and released one last warm note. The sweetness matched the scent traveling faintly from the baskets under the eave. Blue-gray evening deepened over Fennel Reach. The last pale traces of mist moved between the terraces rather than covering them. Lavender End lay quiet. The channel drew a continuous dark line through it, toward the pool. Leela called softly that the record page was dry. Amara answered that she was coming. She remained for 3 more droplets, one from the nearest reed, one from somewhere across the pool, and one that traveled down several leaves before it reached the water. Then she stood and followed the firm return path. At the eave, Aaron had left the ringed baskets open. Their woven sides were already beginning to dry. The straight bundles rested above them, useful stems aligned without being bound too tightly. Amara slid the finished record into its oilcloth pocket. Leela closed the biscuit tin. Aaron lowered the simple wooden latch on the tool cabinet. None of the sounds carried urgency. They looked once more down the cleared run. Water reached every lower terrace evenly. No fallen fennel remained in the channel. Under the eave, every salvaged stem had a place to dry, and the rinsed baskets shed their final beads onto stone. Night settled over the misty terraces without concealing unfinished work. The cleared channel kept its soft, even course through the darkening fennel. The reeds released another scatter of droplets into the resting pool, and Amara listened until the spaces between them grew long and quiet.